On the morning of March 14, 1981, the Continental Trust Bank in downtown Philadelphia discovered that $673,000 had vanished from their main vault over a single weekend. No alarms had been triggered. No doors had been forced. No windows had been broken. The theft was so clean, so perfectly executed, that investigators initially suspected it might have been an inside job, orchestrated by senior management. What made this case truly extraordinary wasn't just the audacity of the theft or the substantial sum that disappeared. It was what happened next. The man responsible for one of the most sophisticated bank heists in Pennsylvania history didn't flee to Mexico or disappear into the criminal underworld. Instead, he did something far more brazen and unthinkable. He assumed the identity of a missing child, inserted himself into a grieving family's life, and lived among them for 7 years while investigators searched for a ghost. His name was Terence DeWitt, and by the time authorities finally connected the dots in 1988, he had become so thoroughly embedded in his new identity that even those closest to him struggled to believe the truth. The unraveling of his elaborate deception would reveal not just a masterful thief, but a man who had studied human psychology and grief with the same meticulous attention he had applied to cracking the bank's security systems. This is the story of how one man pulled off the perfect crime, built a second life on a foundation of lies, and how a single photograph would ultimately expose everything. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Terence DeWitt was 32 years old in 1979 when he first started working at Continental Trust Bank as an assistant vault manager. Born and raised in North Philadelphia, Terence had grown up in a working-class neighborhood where his father worked double shifts at a steel mill and his mother cleaned houses to make ends meet. He was the youngest of 4 children, and unlike his siblings who followed traditional paths into trade work or early marriages, Terence had always been different, curious, observant, patient. He had studied accounting at Community College of Philadelphia, paying his way through school by working nights at a 24-hour diner. His professors remembered him as a quiet student who rarely spoke in class, but consistently achieved perfect scores on exams. He had a gift for numbers, an almost supernatural ability to see patterns where others saw chaos. After graduation, he bounced between several entry-level positions at various financial institutions before landing the job at Continental Trust in the summer of 1979. The bank itself was an institution in Philadelphia, a limestone and marble edifice that had stood on Market Street since 1923. It catered to both commercial clients and wealthy individuals, and by the late 1970s, it held accounts worth over $40 million. The main vault, located 2 floors below street level, was a fortress of steel and concrete installed in 1961. It featured a time-delayed combination lock, motion sensors, and a sophisticated alarm system that connected directly to the Philadelphia Police Department's central station. Terence's job was relatively straightforward. He assisted the head vault manager, Gerald Hutchinson, with daily operations, maintained records of deposits and withdrawals, and ensured that all security protocols were followed. The position paid modestly, $32,000 a year, enough to cover rent on his 1-bedroom apartment in Fishtown and maintain a simple lifestyle. But Terence had never been motivated purely by money. What fascinated him was the puzzle, the challenge, the intricate dance of systems and human behavior that kept the vault secure. For the first 6 months, he simply watched and learned. He studied Gerald's routines with an anthropologist's patience, noting every habit, every shortcut, every moment of human error. Gerald was 58 years old, a creature of habit who had worked at Continental Trust for 33 years. He arrived every morning at exactly 7:15, stopped at the same coffee cart on the corner, and spent the first 20 minutes of his day reading the Philadelphia Inquirer in his office. He was meticulous about most things, but Terence noticed small cracks in his armor. Gerald sometimes left security logs incomplete. He occasionally forgot to double-check the vault's secondary locks. And most importantly, he kept a handwritten notebook in his desk drawer where he recorded the vault's combination sequences, a clear violation of bank policy. Terence never confronted Gerald about these lapses. Instead, he quietly documented them, creating a mental map of vulnerabilities that might someday prove useful. He wasn't planning anything yet. He was simply doing what he had always done, observing, calculating, storing information away for future reference. The turning point came in January 1980, when Terence's mother was diagnosed with lung cancer. The medical bills arrived like an avalanche, crushing any hope his family had of staying afloat financially. His father's steel mill had recently closed, putting him out of work at 63 with minimal pension. His siblings had their own families to support, their own struggles to manage. Terence found himself drowning in debt, taking out personal loans he had no realistic way of repaying, watching his mother's health deteriorate while knowing that better treatment existed just beyond their financial reach. She died on a Tuesday morning in April, and something in Terence died with her. Not his conscience exactly, but his faith in the systems he had always trusted. He had worked hard, followed the rules, done everything right, and still the world had crushed his family beneath the weight of circumstances beyond their control. The bank he worked for held $40 million in assets, serving clients who spent more on vacation homes than his mother's entire cancer treatment would have cost. The anger didn't make him reckless. If anything, it sharpened his focus, transformed his observations from idle curiosity into serious planning. He began staying late at the office, volunteering for weekend shifts, always the helpful employee eager to learn more about the bank's operations. Gerald appreciated his dedication and gradually gave him more responsibilities, more access, more trust. Over the next 11 months, Terence assembled a complete understanding of Continental Trust's security architecture. He learned that the vault's alarm system, while sophisticated for its era, relied on analog sensors that could be manipulated if you understood their timing cycles. He discovered that the time delay mechanism, designed to prevent quick access even with the correct combination, had a maintenance override that Gerald used monthly during routine inspections. He mapped out the bank's electrical systems and found that the backup generator, installed in the basement, had a manual cutoff switch that wasn't connected to any alarm. But technical knowledge wasn't enough. Terence understood that the most sophisticated security system in the world was still operated by human beings, and human beings could be predicted, manipulated, understood. He studied the weekend security guards, learning their patterns, their personalities, their weaknesses. He befriended them, brought them coffee, learned their names and their stories. They began to see him as harmless, trustworthy, invisible. The plan that eventually took shape was elegant in its simplicity. Terence would create a maintenance emergency that required the vault to remain open during a weekend. He would ensure he was the person called in to handle it, and he would have approximately 8 hours between the Friday evening closing and the Saturday morning guard shift change to extract the money and disappear. But disappearing wasn't enough. Terence had studied enough criminal cases to know that the FBI's track record for catching bank robbers was exceptionally high, particularly in cases involving large sums. They would examine every employee, every person with vault access, every individual with financial troubles or personal motives. They would scrutinize Terence's life, his bank accounts, his connections. Running would immediately mark him as guilty. He needed something more sophisticated. He needed an identity that came with its own history, its own alibis, its own reasons for appearing suddenly in the world. And in the fall of 1980, while researching missing persons cases at the Philadelphia Public Library, he found exactly what he was looking for. The Carver family lived in suburban Baltimore, Maryland. Thomas and Patricia Carver were in their mid-50s, successful professionals who had suffered an unimaginable tragedy in 1972 when their 7-year-old son, Michael, disappeared from a shopping mall parking lot. The case had received extensive media coverage throughout Maryland and Pennsylvania. Despite a massive search effort and thousands of tips, Michael Carver was never found. By 1980, he would have been 15 years old, exactly the age where a traumatized teenager might conceivably have survived on the streets for years before seeking to reconnect with his family. Terence studied everything about Michael Carver he could find. He read old newspaper articles, reviewed police reports available through public records, even visited Baltimore to observe the Carver home from a distance. He learned that Michael had a distinctive birthmark on his left shoulder blade, that he had been a quiet child who loved drawing, that he had a slight lisp when pronouncing words with the letter S. Most importantly, he learned that Thomas and Patricia Carver had never stopped looking for their son, never stopped hoping that someday he might return to them. The psychological dimension of Terence's plan was perhaps its most disturbing element. He wasn't simply stealing an identity. He was weaponizing grief, using a family's deepest wound as his escape route. But by this point, whatever moral reservations he might have once possessed had been burned away by anger and desperation. The final piece fell into place in February 1981, when Gerald Hutchinson mentioned that the Vault's climate control system needed recalibration. Continental Trust had recently begun storing rare document collections for a historical society, materials that required precise temperature and humidity control. Gerald scheduled the maintenance for the second weekend in March, a time when the bank would be closed and the work could proceed without interrupting normal operations. Terence volunteered immediately to supervise the maintenance work, knowing Gerald would appreciate not having to come in on a Saturday. His offer was accepted without suspicion. Everything was falling into place with a precision that felt almost predestined. On Friday, March 13, 1981, Terence DeWitt arrived at Continental Trust Bank at 7 in the morning for what would be his final day as an employee. The weather was cold and overcast, typical for Philadelphia in early spring. He wore his usual outfit: grey slacks, white button-down shirt, navy tie, and a worn leather jacket that had belonged to his father. He carried a canvas messenger bag containing his lunch and a thermos of coffee, items that were searched cursorily by the morning security guard. A routine check that found nothing suspicious. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Terence performed his normal duties with machine-like precision, aware that every action was potentially his last as Terence DeWitt and needed to appear completely ordinary. He processed deposit forms, assisted clients accessing safety deposit boxes, and reviewed the week's transaction logs with Gerald. At 3 in the afternoon, the maintenance contractor arrived, a climate control specialist named Donald Reeves, who had worked with Continental Trust on previous projects. Terence and Donald spent the next 2 hours reviewing the Vault's environmental systems, mapping out the work that would need to be completed the following day. Donald was professional and thorough, asking detailed questions about the Vault's specifications and taking careful measurements. He had no way of knowing that Terence had specifically requested his company, because Donald was known in the industry for his punctuality and his habit of leaving job sites by early evening, a detail Terence had learned through casual conversation months earlier. The bank closed at 5. The regular employees filed out, heading home to their families and weekend plans. Gerald stopped by Terence's desk to confirm the arrangements for Saturday, reminding him to set the alarm properly when he left and to call if any complications arose with the maintenance work. Terence assured him everything would be fine, maintaining the same calm demeanor he had cultivated for nearly 2 years. By 6:30, the building was nearly empty. The evening security guard, Raymond Foster, made his rounds, checking doors and windows, verifying that all offices were locked. Raymond was 61 years old, a former Philadelphia police officer who had retired to a less strenuous career. He trusted Terence, had known him for almost 2 years, and saw no reason for concern when Terence mentioned he would be staying late to prepare materials for the Saturday maintenance work. Terence waited until Raymond completed his rounds and settled into the guard station on the first floor. Then he began the most critical phase of his plan. First, he accessed Gerald's office using a key he had duplicated months earlier during a bathroom break when Gerald had left his key ring on his desk. The notebook containing the vault combination sequences was exactly where it had always been, tucked in the bottom drawer beneath a stack of old banking journals. Terence had memorized the current sequence weeks ago during a similar late-night visit, but he photographed the pages anyway using a small camera, insurance against the possibility that the combination had been changed. Next, he made his way to the basement, moving through the empty building with purposeful confidence. If questioned, he was simply inspecting the electrical systems in preparation for the maintenance work. But no one questioned him. The building was silent except for the distant hum of ventilation, systems, and the occasional creak of old pipes. The backup generator's manual cutoff switch was located behind a metal panel secured with a simple padlock. Terence had brought bolt cutters, hidden in his messenger bag beneath a false bottom he had constructed. The lock yielded with a quiet snap that seemed impossibly loud in the basement's stillness. He didn't cut the power yet. That would happen later, at precisely the right moment. He returned to the main floor and found Raymond in the guard station, eating a sandwich and watching a small black and white television that showed the evening news. Terence made small talk for a few minutes, establishing his presence, ensuring Raymond would remember later that everything had seemed normal. Then he excused himself, claiming he needed to finish preparing some documents before heading home. At 9:40, Terence returned to the basement and threw the generator's cut-off switch. The building's lights flickered and died, plunging everything into darkness except for the emergency exit signs powered by independent batteries. Upstairs, Raymond would be checking the circuit breakers, following standard protocol for a power outage. He would call the electric company, file a report, and settle in to wait for the power to return. What he wouldn't know was that the backup generator had been manually disabled, and that the vault's alarm system, dependent on continuous power to maintain its armed state, had just entered a vulnerable reset cycle. Terence moved through the darkness, using a small flashlight, navigating the building from memory. He reached the vault level and approached the massive steel door that represented the culmination of nearly 2 years of planning. His hands were steady as he spun the combination dial, counting clicks, feeling the mechanism's resistance and release. The time delay mechanism would normally require a 20-minute wait, but Terence had studied Gerald's maintenance override procedure dozens of times. He accessed the control panel hidden behind a small hatch, entered the override code, and heard the satisfying thunk of locking bolts retracting. The vault door swung open. Inside, the air was cool and dry, carefully regulated to protect the documents and securities stored on floor-to-ceiling shelves. Terence had mapped the vault's interior layout months ago and knew exactly where to find what he needed. The cash reserves were stored in locked metal drawers in the vault's southeast corner, organized by denomination and documented in ledgers that were reconciled weekly. He had brought 2 additional items in his messenger bag: a canvas duffel bag that could be folded into a compact square, and a small pry bar for forcing the cash drawer locks. The drawers weren't designed to resist determined attack from someone already inside the vault. They were administrative security, meant to organize and track cash, not to prevent access by someone who had already bypassed the vault itself. The first drawer yielded bundles of $100 bills, each stack held together with paper bands marking them as $5,000. Terence worked methodically, counting as he transferred the money to the duffel bag. He took only from drawers that held large denominations, knowing that smaller bills would create too much bulk and weight. 100,000, 200,000, 400,000, 600,000. He stopped at $673,000, not because he had run out of cash to take, but because that was the amount he had calculated weeks earlier as being optimal. Large enough to sustain his plans for decades if managed carefully, small enough that it represented less than 2% of the bank's total holdings, possibly avoiding immediate catastrophic scrutiny, and specific enough that it didn't look like a round number grab by someone working quickly in darkness. The entire extraction took 46 minutes. Terence left the cash drawers open, but otherwise undisturbed, a detail that would later confuse investigators. He carefully wiped down surfaces he had touched, removed the photograph camera from his jacket pocket, and took several pictures of the open vault for reasons he couldn't entirely articulate, perhaps as proof to himself that he had actually done it. Before leaving, he made one final calculation. The maintenance work scheduled for tomorrow would provide the perfect cover for the discovery, but he needed to ensure the timeline worked in his favor. He used the pry bar to damage the climate control system's control panel, creating a legitimate failure that would explain the vault remaining open longer than normal. Then he exited the vault, closed the massive door without engaging the locks, and began the process of reversing his intrusion. At 11:20, he restored power to the building by resetting the backup generator. The lights flickered back on throughout Continental Trust, and he could hear Raymond's relieved exclamation from the upstairs guard station. Terence used the brief confusion of the power restoration to slip into a restroom, where he changed clothes completely, stuffing his work outfit into the messenger bag and emerging in jeans and a dark sweater that he had hidden in the building earlier in the week. He left through a service exit on the building's north side, an entrance used by maintenance staff that wasn't directly visible from the guard station. He had disabled its alarm sensor weeks ago during a legitimate maintenance check, a tiny act of sabotage that no one had noticed. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and Terence DeWitt walked into the Philadelphia night carrying $673,000 and a plan that would require him to become someone else entirely. He spent that night in a motel in Trenton, New Jersey, paying cash and using a false name. He didn't sleep. Instead, he counted the money properly, organizing it into manageable bundles and securing it in a locked briefcase he had purchased weeks earlier. Then he began the psychological transformation that would define the next 7 years of his life. Becoming Michael Carver required more than simply claiming the name. Terence had spent months researching the psychology of recovered missing children, reading case studies and psychiatric evaluations. He understood that the Carvers would be desperate to believe their son had returned, but they would also be cautious, protective, aware that they might be dealing with an imposter. He would need to embody Michael's trauma, his confusion, his damaged memory of the past 8 years. On March 18th, 4 days after the theft, a 15-year-old boy appeared at a Baltimore police station claiming to be Michael Carver. He was thin, exhausted, and clearly traumatized. He told a story of abduction, years of captivity, and finally escape from a man he could barely describe through his panic and tears. He remembered fragments of his childhood, the Carver house, his parents' faces, his bedroom's blue wallpaper. He had a birthmark on his left shoulder blade that matched Michael's description. His fingerprints, never recorded before his disappearance, couldn't rule him out. Thomas and Patricia Carver arrived at the police station within an hour of being notified. They spent 3 hours with the boy who claimed to be their son, asking questions, showing photographs, desperately searching for confirmation or contradiction. The boy's memories were fragmentary but plausible. He remembered the shopping mall where Michael had vanished. He remembered details that only Michael would know. And most importantly, he remembered them. The reunion was covered extensively by Baltimore and Philadelphia media. The miracle return of Michael Carver after 8 years missing captured public imagination and sympathy. Law enforcement conducted investigations into his claims, but the boy's story, while vague about his captor's specifics, was consistent and supported by genuine psychological trauma. A pediatric psychiatrist who evaluated him reported findings consistent with severe childhood trauma and dissociation. DNA testing existed but was not yet widely used in 1981 for missing persons cases. Thomas and Patricia Carver chose to believe. Perhaps they had no other choice. After 8 years of grief and uncertainty, their son had returned, damaged but alive. They brought him home, enrolled him in therapy, and began the slow process of rebuilding a family that had been shattered. Terence DeWitt, now Michael Carver, settled into his new life with the same patience and discipline he had applied to planning the theft. The money remained untouched, hidden in a storage facility in Delaware that he had rented months earlier using a false identity. He couldn't access it yet, not while the investigation into Continental Trust's Robbery remained active and scrutiny on all recent missing persons cases remained intense. The FBI's investigation into the bank theft was massive and sophisticated. Special Agent Helen Crawford, assigned to lead the case, immediately recognized the robbery's unusual characteristics. The lack of forced entry, the precise knowledge of the vault systems, and the careful amount stolen all pointed to an inside job. Every employee with vault access was investigated thoroughly. Terence DeWitt, who had vanished immediately after the theft, became the primary suspect within 48 hours. But finding Terence proved impossible. His apartment had been abandoned, cleared of personal belongings. His bank accounts contained less than $800. His family, interviewed extensively, insisted they had no knowledge of his whereabouts and appeared genuinely confused by his disappearance. His few friends reported that he had seemed depressed and withdrawn since his mother's death, but had given no indication of planning anything criminal. Agent Crawford pursued hundreds of leads over the following months. She investigated possible connections to organized crime, searched for evidence of money laundering, and coordinated with international law enforcement agencies in case Terence had fled the country. She was thorough, intelligent, and determined, but she never connected Terence DeWitt to Michael Carver because the timeline seemed impossible. Michael had appeared in Baltimore 4 days after the theft, and his story of years-long captivity had been corroborated by psychiatric evaluation and accepted by the Carver family. As Michael Carver, Terence lived a carefully controlled existence for the next 7 years. He attended high school in Baltimore, maintaining mediocre grades that wouldn't attract attention. He participated in therapy sessions, gradually recovering memories that aligned with his cover story, while ensuring enough remained vague to avoid contradiction. He maintained appropriate distance from his adopted parents, the natural wariness of a traumatized child, while slowly building trust and affection that appeared genuine. The money remained untouched in Delaware, gathering dust while Terence waited for the investigation to grow cold and for his new identity to become thoroughly established. He lived on Thomas and Patricia's modest support, worked part-time jobs for pocket money, and behaved exactly like a recovered kidnapping victim trying to rebuild a normal life. The psychological toll was more substantial than he had anticipated. Living a lie, maintaining a false identity, pretending to be someone's lost child while knowing the pain his deception caused required a daily compartmentalization that gradually eroded his sense of self. There were moments, particularly late at night, when he questioned whether the money had been worth it, whether he had destroyed something essential in himself by weaponizing the Carver family's grief. But he had committed to this path, and Terence had always been patient, disciplined, methodical. He would see it through. In 1985, when Michael turned 20, he graduated high school and expressed interest in attending art school, reviving the drawing talent that the real Michael had possessed. Thomas and Patricia supported this decision, relieved to see their son developing interests and plans for the future. Michael enrolled at the Maryland Institute College of Art, maintaining his quiet, withdrawn personality while beginning to slowly access the hidden money through carefully structured transactions that couldn't be traced. He created a small graphic design business as a front for his income, producing actual work for real clients to establish legitimacy. The business was modestly successful, providing believable cover for a gradually improving financial situation. He dated occasionally, maintained a small circle of friends, and appeared to be healing, growing, becoming the person Michael Carver might have been if he hadn't disappeared. By 1987, 6 years after the theft, Terence had successfully integrated into his false identity so completely that he sometimes struggled to remember his previous life. The FBI's investigation into Continental Trust had officially gone cold, with Terence DeWitt listed as a fugitive but no longer actively pursued. Special Agent Crawford had retired, moving on to other cases, and the file was relegated to inactive status. Terence believed he had gotten away with it. He had pulled off the perfect crime, executed the perfect escape, built a perfect new life on the foundation of someone else's tragedy. What he didn't know was that perfect crimes are only perfect until they're not, and that the past has a way of reaching forward to claim what it's owed. The unraveling began with something absurdly simple: a photograph. In October 1988, the Philadelphia Inquirer ran a retrospective feature on unsolved crimes from the 1980s. It was part of a series commemorating the newspaper's anniversary, looking back at mysteries that had captivated the city and remained unsolved. The Continental Trust robbery was featured prominently, with several photographs of the bank, interviews with retired investigators, and most significantly, an employee photo of Terence DeWitt from his Continental Trust personnel file. The article was distributed widely, picked up by several other newspapers in Pennsylvania and neighboring states. One of those newspapers was delivered to a home in Wilmington, Delaware, where a woman named Janet Foster was having her morning coffee. Janet Foster was Raymond Foster's daughter. Raymond, the security guard who had been on duty the night of the robbery, had died of a heart attack in 1984, never knowing that he had spoken with the thief on the evening of the crime. But Janet remembered her father talking about that night, remembered him mentioning the helpful young vault assistant who had stayed late and had been so friendly during their brief conversation before the power went out. She also had a neighbor whose 15-year-old son was attending a special art program at the Maryland Institute College of Art, and she had met some of his classmates at a recent exhibition. One of them, a quiet 22-year-old named Michael Carver, had seemed familiar to her in a way she couldn't quite place. When she saw Terence DeWitt's photograph in the newspaper, the connection crystallized with shocking clarity. The face was older in her memory, more mature, but the features were unmistakable. Michael Carver and Terence DeWitt were the same person. Janet Foster called the Philadelphia Police Department that afternoon. Her tip was initially dismissed as unlikely, another well-meaning but ultimately useless lead in a cold case. But she persisted, calling the FBI's Philadelphia field office and explaining the connection with enough detail that a junior agent decided it warranted investigation. The agent's name was Marcus Chen, and he was young enough to see the case as an opportunity rather than a burden. He pulled the Continental Trust file, reviewed Terence DeWitt's personnel photo, and then requested images from the Baltimore Police Department's files on Michael Carver's recovery in 1981. The resemblance was striking once you knew to look for it. But more than physical appearance, the timeline was suspicious. Michael Carver had appeared just days after Terence DeWitt had vanished. The geographic proximity of Philadelphia and Baltimore, the convenience of a missing child identity that provided perfect cover and sympathetic protection from scrutiny. Agent Chen brought his findings to his supervisor, who authorized a full investigation. Within a week, they had assembled a comprehensive case file that suggested Michael Carver might actually be Terence DeWitt, but proving it would require concrete evidence, not just photographic similarity and suspicious timing. The FBI approached the investigation carefully. They couldn't simply arrest Michael Carver without substantial proof, particularly given the sensitive nature of his identity as a recovered kidnapping victim. They needed irrefutable evidence before taking action. They started with background investigation, quietly examining Michael's life in Baltimore. They discovered his small graphic design business and began tracing his financial transactions. What they found was revealing. Small cash deposits that had begun in 1985, always under the reporting threshold, but accumulated over 3 years, totaling approximately $200,000. The deposits had been careful, spread across multiple accounts, but the pattern was there once you knew to look for it. Next, they obtained Michael's fingerprints through a routine traffic stop, a minor infraction that provided a legal excuse for identification. Those prints were compared to evidence from Continental Trust, specifically items that Terence DeWitt had handled regularly in his work. The analysis took 3 weeks. The result was definitive. Michael Carver's fingerprints matched prints found on documents in Terence DeWitt's former workspace. The final piece came from forensic accountants who had been tracking the stolen money's potential trail for 7 years. They discovered the Delaware storage facility through records of cash transactions and rental agreements. A surveillance warrant revealed that Michael Carver had visited the facility twice in the past year. When agents obtained a search warrant and opened the storage unit in January 1988, they found approximately $450,000 in cash, still bundled with the original Continental Trust paper bands. On February 12, 1988, 7 years after the theft and 7 years into his life as Michael Carver, Terence DeWitt was arrested at his apartment in Baltimore. The arrest was conducted quietly, with sensitivity to the Carver family's situation. Thomas and Patricia Carver were informed immediately before the arrest became public, given the devastating news that their son had not actually returned, that they had been living with an imposter who had exploited their grief for his own purposes. The trial was a media sensation. Terence's defense attorneys argued diminished capacity, pointing to the trauma of his mother's death and his subsequent psychological breakdown. They presented him as a desperate man who had made terrible decisions, but hadn't intended to hurt the Carver family. The prosecution presented him as a calculating criminal who had planned every detail with cold precision, who had weaponized a family's tragedy and stolen not just money, but 7 years of their lives. The jury found him guilty on all counts: bank theft, identity fraud, and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for 15 years. Thomas and Patricia Carver attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row, watching the man they had believed was their son revealed as a stranger. In a statement read after the verdict, Thomas said simply, "We lost our son Michael twice, once to whoever took him in 1972, and once to the man who pretended to be him and gave us false hope. We don't know which loss hurts more." The case prompted significant changes in how law enforcement handles missing persons cases. DNA testing, which had been emerging technology in the early 1980s, became standard protocol for verifying identities of recovered missing children. Database systems were established to track patterns and connections that might reveal identity fraud. The Carver family's ordeal became a cautionary tale studied in FBI training programs. Continental Trust Bank recovered approximately $450,000 from the storage facility, but the remaining $223,000 was never found, presumably spent carefully over 7 years to maintain Michael's cover and establish his business. The bank upgraded its security systems substantially, installing biometric access controls and implementing redundant alarm systems that couldn't be bypassed by simple power interruption. Terence DeWitt is currently incarcerated at FCI Fort Dix in New Jersey, now 68 years old and eligible for parole in 2026. He has given only one interview since his conviction in 1995, during which he expressed remorse for deceiving the Carver family, but maintained that the bank theft itself had been justified by his circumstances. He refused to discuss where the missing money had gone, and investigators eventually concluded it had been spent gradually over the years, integrated into his life so completely that tracing it became impossible. The real Michael Carver was never found. The case remains open in Baltimore, though after 43 years, hope of discovering what happened to him has faded to statistical impossibility. The story of Terence DeWitt stands as one of the most psychologically complex crimes in modern American history, a case where the theft of money was almost secondary to the theft of identity, where grief was weaponized and exploited, and where one man's desperation and anger created ripples of pain that extended far beyond the bank he robbed. It's a reminder that the most sophisticated security systems in the world remain vulnerable to human intelligence and desperation, and that the perfect crime often unravels through the smallest, most unexpected details: a newspaper article, a neighbor's memory, a photograph that connects past to present and reveals the truth beneath the lies.